Good morning, and welcome to the First Unitarian Church. Let me tell you, it's good to be back. I want to thank you, I want to thank Matthew and David, and of course Robert Fulgham for making it possible for me to take some time to travel this fall. It is indeed a glorious time to be on the road, and truthfully, it was the very first time I had such an experience to actually travel in the autumn. But I'll tell you, I got it out of my system, so I won't need to make a habit of it. I return now to this church community that I value so deeply. Come here this morning with a weighty matter for us to consider in the service. What does it mean being white in a country which has, especially of late, manifested such blatant forms of racism? Cornel West has called these times we live in a state of emergency. And I think Cornel West raises this concern because we have moved from an anti-black racism to state-sanctioned violence. And this all seems to be fueled by unconscionable political rhetoric that we hear over and over again in this year's presidential election campaign. And nobody's sure about next steps in these tension-filled times. But still, somehow, the dream of justice and the hope of equality remain miraculously in our hearts. It could not be otherwise. We have a deep and abiding faith in the endless possibilities of love. Symbol of light and of knowledge, symbol of warmth and freedom. We light this chalice as a symbol of our faith. Here we gather to celebrate hope and the infinite possibilities of love. May we open our service this morning by turning our hymn books, please, to number 122.
Voices morning. We take a moment as we gather each week to pause, to join each other in creating a silence that is precious, and to remind ourselves that our lives are part of a larger chorus. So I invite you now to turn in silence towards that which you find most holy, for prayer, for meditation, and for reflection. Listen, rise, hope. Most holy, beloved Spirit of life, we pause for these moments on this day to listen, to think and to feel and to know. We pause to face in stillness the truths of life, of our own lives, common and separate and secret, and of the larger life, common too, that connects us all. The breath that we breathe, that breathes us, the heart beats, the rhythms of life that pulse through us and race, neurons firing, muscles working just to sit still. Listen, rise, hope. In the holy quiet, we listen and look and feel for the movements of life amid wars and rumors of war, amid corruption and allegations of corruption, amid racism and sexism and all of the cultures of violence and greed and fear that drive us, that permeate our hearts and minds, no matter how pure or right we claim or aim to be. Listen, rise, hope. On this day, in this hour, in the common endeavor, help us once again to see and know, to be seen and known. Not that we would be righteous or even right, but that we might be a part of the larger movement of peace and justice and love in this world. In our homes and our hearts, in our marketplaces and our workplaces, in our families, among friends and strangers, even foes. Loosen our clinging to truths and selves of which we are so certain, and ready us to receive renewed truths, renewed selves, transformed in relation, joined as one in breath and heartbeat and stillness and silence. Lift us to a higher, broader, clearer horizon this hour. Show us vistas inward and outward that will illumine and inspire. challenge us with difficult truths, and equip us with courage and strength to live into the lives to which they call us. Here and now in this place, among these people, most holy beloved, meet our longings and hear our silent yearnings. These and all the unspoken prayers in our hearts we offer in all the names of all that is holy. Shalom, salam, amen, and blessed be.
God gave to Noah the rainbow sign. No more rain, the fire next time. Those are the words that inspired James Baldwin to write his two magnificent essays under the name of The Fire Next Time. It refers, of course, to the great covenant. The rainbow is a sign of the covenant made between God and Noah. And God said, well, I got a little upset with people, but and I just unleashed all this anger. But here's the covenant. Here's the rainbow saying that I won't do that again. But he always still reserved the right to be judgmental. And even though there wouldn't be the great flood now, it'll be the fire next time. So James Baldwin talked about, looking at how blacks are trying to conduct their lives in a very hostile environment. And there's always this sense of there's this judgment going on. Hey, America, wake up. There's this judgment. It's going to be the fire next time. 53 years after the publication of The Fire Next Time, a whole new generation of African American writers put together a book called The Fire This Time. There's no more waiting for this judgment and the wrath of God, the fire next time. No, the fire this time. It's a very, very different tone. And I certainly recommend the book called The Fire This Time, a composite of many younger African-American writers. The one I want to share this morning is by Isabel Wilkerson in a piece called Where Do We Go From Here? Before the summer of 2014, we had seen Eric Gardner dying on a Staten Island street and Michael Brown lifeless in the Missouri sun for hours before the grand jury decisions and the die-ins that shut down interstates. We may have lulled ourselves into believing that the struggle was over, that it had all been taken care of back in 1964, that the marching and bloodshed had established once and for all the basic rights of people who had been at the bottom for centuries. We may have believed that, if nothing else, the civil rights movement had defined a bar beneath which we could not fall. But history tells us otherwise. We seem to be in a continuing feedback loop of repeating a past that our country has not yet addressed. Our history is one of spectacular achievement, as in black senators of the Reconstruction era, or the advances that culminated in the election of Barack Obama, followed by a violent backlash that threatens to erase the gains, and then a long, slow climb to the next mountain where the cycle begins again. The last reversal of black advancement was so crushing that historians call it the nadir. It followed the leaps African Americans made after enslavement during the cracked window of opportunity known as Reconstruction. The newly freed people built schools and businesses and ascended to high office. But a conservative counter-reaction led to a gutting of the civil rights laws of that time and to the start of a Jim Crow caste system in the South that restricted every step an African American could make. Any breach of the system could mean one's life. African Americans were lynched over accusations of mundane infractions such as stealing a hog or 75 cents during a period that lasted into the 1940s. 6 million African Americans fled that caste system, seeking asylum in the rest of the country during what would become the Great Migration. Denied the ballot, they voted with their bodies. Their defection put pressure on the country, North and South, and freed them to pursue their dreams of self-determination. But in the North, they were met with hostility from the onset, redlining, over-policing, hyper-segregation, the seeds of the disparities we see today. The past few months have forced us to confront our place in a country where we were enslaved for far longer than we have been free. Forced us to face the dispiriting erosion that we have witnessed in recent years, from the birther assaults on a sitting black president to the gutting of the Voting Rights Act that we had believed was carved in granite. And now, police assaults on black people for the most ordinary human behaviors. A father tasered in Minnesota while waiting for his children. A motorist shot to death in North Carolina while seeking help after a car accident. It is as if we have re-entered the past and are living in a second nadir. It seems the rate of police killings now surpasses the rate of lynchings during the worst decade of the Jim Crow era. There was a lynching every 4 days in the early decades of the 20th century. It's been estimated that an African American is now killed by police every 2 days. The outcomes in Staten Island and Ferguson and elsewhere signal as in the time of Jim Crow, that the loss of black life at the hands of authorities does not so much as merit further inquiry, and that the caste system has only mutated with the times. From this we have learned that the journey is far from over, and that we must know our history to gain strength for the days ahead. We must love ourselves even if, and perhaps especially if, others do not. We must keep our faith even as we work to make our country live up to its creed. And we must know deep in our bones and in our hearts that if the ancestors could survive the Middle Passage, we can survive anything. It's good to come together as a church in hard times as well as joyous times, with an opportunity to kind of review the whole panorama of emotions. I hope that everyone takes the time to look seriously at the announcements in the order of service today. So many people, especially when they're new to this church, say that they really want to find a community and be connected. And here are just myriad opportunities of connecting with wonderful, bright, loving people. And you figure out which venue is best for you. And be sure to grab hold of it. Let me just say in passing, two quick reminders. One is the Halloween party. It's going to be here on October the 25th. I'm going to mark that. And also really important, twice a year we do a highway cleanup. It's wonderful. It's great to see the sign. In fact, it's very close to where I live. And I love to pass the sign that says, "This highway is cleaned, First Unitarian Church." And I go, oh, how great. So we need to do this. It's a part of our environmental ministry. And it's going to happen on Saturday, October 29th. And you know that this is a serious project because it says to be there at 0900. Yes, sir. But I hope everybody has a chance to help out. Also want to say, we got an adult ed program underway, Building Your Own Theology. And a curious thing happened, and that is, even though the registration was for what we had planned for 16, 22 people signed up, and I thought, oh, okay, that's great. And of the 22 people who signed up, 5 actually showed. And so, what I'd like to do is extend yet another invitation, although if you join us, this meets Thursday nights from 7 to 9. This will be then the second week of 6, so we'll have 5 more continuous Thursday meetings. If you are interested, please let me know after the service, and I will hand you and discuss with you a homework assignment that I hope which is not meant to scare you, but is meant to encourage you. And we'll just go over some of the instructions of that homework assignment. It's a writing assignment, and it's really a very valuable experience. So Building Your Own Theology, Thursday, 7 to 9. If you still want to come, let me know after the service. The offering will now gratefully be received, a chance to greet one another and bid each other a warm welcome on this rainy Sunday morning. The great jazz trumpeter Terence Blanchard recently put out an album called Breathless. He featured the title song in a concert last August in Clove Lakes Park on Staten Island. He wrote it as an elegy for Eric Garner, who died at the hands of police officers on Staten Island about 2 years ago. Mr. Garner's last words, "I can't breathe," were uttered as a police officer held him in a chokehold. I bought the album, listened to Breathless, and tried to hold back my tears. It's a haunting piece. The trumpet solo is so clean, so piercing, so aching, as it plays over the spoken word recited by Blanchard's son. And he says, "Am I wrong for believing that one day black and blue would not equal pain?" And then a moment later, you hear him speak, "These black roses grow from cracked pavements, freshly watered with the tears of the voiceless, as we'll emit a muted scream to the heavens. We can't breathe." Mr. Garner's last words were pluralized. We can't breathe. And I wondered, how inclusive is the we? Who is meant by we can't breathe? Is this exclusively an African American emotion whose mantra, "we can't breathe," applies only to the black experience? I guess it is. Being white and privileged, it never occurs to me that a policeman could potentially close off my air supply. That's simply not part of my gestalt. But at the same time, I still weep when a black man has been suffocated, and my insides ache when black person after black person after black person dies with no one held accountable. Black life has been devalued for a long time. If jazz serves as a reference point, we'll have to consider the Louis Armstrong 1929 recording, "What Did I Do to Be So Black and Blue?" Billie Holiday's 1939 ballad on lynching called "Strange Fruit." If you don't know that piece, and all these bodies hanging from the trees, she says, wow, strange fruit, isn't it? Charlie Mingus in 1959 wrote Fables of Faubus about school integration. 1960, Max Roach wrote, "We insist, freedom now." 1963, John Coltrane's Alabama was recorded in response to the church burnings in Birmingham. A lot of pain, a lot of singularly identified black pain emanating from the black experience of living in an America which has never extended its promise and dream to citizens of color. Is white empathy possible? I don't think so. But what are you supposed to do with your feelings? I'm beginning to wonder if true empathy can really ever exist. Are there not boundaries we erect between our experience and everyone else's? Are we capable of understanding the suffering or even relating to the suffering of those unlike ourselves? I remember carpooling with a parishioner quite some distance to some church function. This man was desperately fighting alcoholism with moderate success. And suddenly he asked me, "Do you have any idea how many bars and taverns we have passed thus far?" I remained silent. 16, he barked. You wouldn't know that. You wouldn't care. You'll never understand. But the truth is, I did care, although I wasn't in his skin. My dearest colleague, a few years older than I, lost his wife not long ago, and we had quite a talk. There were a lot of tears shed, not only for his wife's death. There was more. He said, "I realize only now that after all my many years as minister to those who grieve the loss of a spouse, my counseling was pure bullshit. I didn't really know. I didn't really understand. Now I do. Now I know." And the same could be said for those who have lost a child. These parents comprise their own community of pain, firm in the belief that unless such a death has touched you personally, you can only think you understand. In truth, you don't. I think it's interesting that the GLBTQ community has come up with a concept they call allies. Those straight people who want to be sympathetic, hey, let them. We can put them to use. Although they really don't get it, we'll let them come along for the ride. And it's worked. Many years ago, I served on the board of the Salt Lake Rape Crisis Center. And it took me almost the length of time of my first term to realize that I was there merely as a token male. And of course, being minister didn't hurt. But you know, my opinions were not welcome. I chose not to serve a second term. Can a man feel deep sorrow and outrage when a woman is raped? Oh, yes. Yeah, it may be outside my experience, but isn't there some human connection that transcends the harm unique to a particular demographic? But then, too, I remember my irritation with a colleague, a guy's about 2 years younger than I, also with Jewish ancestry. He spoke about the Holocaust as a Jew. He addressed the suffering and anguish he felt at this unthinkable time in human history. But I knew him pretty well. And so I asked him, what suffering? Your parents, your grandparents came to this country long before the Holocaust and settled into the suburbs of Chicago and led good and opulent lives. What do you know about suffering? My grandparents died in concentration camps, and my parents belonged to that genre known as Holocaust survivors. I was angry because he tried to own my history. He tried to usurp my family's experience. And yet I realize now that his pain was undoubtedly genuine. Now, it's not his fault that he grew up in comfort. He had enormous empathy. But where do you put it? Is a white person capable of weeping while listening to Breathless? Oh, I tell you, it's possible. Do I have a right to weep? I don't know. Holden Session, 26 years old, black and transgendered, in a leadership position of Black Lives Matter, recently said, Black Lives Matter basically says, we don't care about how you feel. We're not about appeasing you or making you feel good for being a liberal white person. He's absolutely right. Of course. But you know, I never wanted to feel good about my liberal politics. It's more that there has been this contemptible ethical violation. And it's that gut-wrenching despair that leaves me feeling so alone. I know I stand outside the black experience when I read Claudia Rankine's essay, also from Black Lives Matter, also from The Fire this time. Her essay is called The Condition of Black Life is Mourning. She writes that there are natural fears of every parent facing the randomness of life. But there's also this other knowledge of the ways in which institutional racism works in our country. She says, though the white liberal imagination likes to feel temporarily bad about black suffering, there's really no mode of empathy that can replicate the daily strain of knowing that as a black person, you can be killed for simply being black. No hands in your pocket, no playing music, no sudden movements, no driving your car, No walking at night, no walking in the day, no turning onto the street, no entering this building, no standing your ground, no standing here, no talking back, no playing with toy guns, no living while black. And she continues, we live in a country where Americans assimilate corpses in their daily comings and goings. Dead blacks are a part of normal life here. Dying in ship hulls tossed into the Atlantic, hanging from trees, beaten, shot in churches, gunned down by the police, or warehoused in prison. Historically, there is no quotidian without the enslaved, chained, or dead black body to gaze upon, or to hear about, or to position a self against. She concludes, when blacks become overwhelmed by our culture's disorder and protest, ultimately to our own detriment, because protest gives the police justification to militarize as they did in Ferguson, the wrong-headed question is asked, what kind of savages are we? Rather than, what kind of country do we live in? Pastor Franz Davis from the Calvary Baptist Church and I were talking recently about track and field. His son ran track in college. It was quite good. We bantered back and forth until I finally bragged that I was friends in high school with Bob Beamon. No one had to explain to Franz who Bob Beamon was. A gold medalist in the 1968 Olympics in Mexico City, whose record for the triple jump lasted for about the next 20 years. It was remarkable. And Franz looked at me kind of suspiciously, and he said, where did you go to high school? I laughed. All I said was Jamaica High School, which incidentally no longer exists. It's a failed school. Yes, it was predominantly African American, had a student body of 5,000. But the story runs a little deeper. I grew up living on the wrong side of the Long Island Railroad, whose train tracks split the community of Hollis in Queens. I was literally the only white kid in the hood. In the 5th grade, I was bused with all my black friends to a white school on the other side of the tracks. Oh, irony. When my friend Archie died of an overdose of heroin in the 7th grade, I went to his funeral in a black church. And when my friend Dwayne died of an overdose of heroin in the 8th grade, I went to his funeral in the black church. I was getting pretty familiar and comfortable with the black church, so much so that I had a hard time adjusting to this unemotional, white Unitarian church which listened intently to intellectual sermons on humanism in the chapel built of cold cinder blocks. When it was learned that Nancy up the street did it for $1, my parents moved. Maybe it would have been different if my church had offered the OWL program. I don't know. But yeah, we moved just 1 mile across the tracks. That's all it took. And it was never the same after that. I had a ticket out. And my white privilege became a barrier between my dear old friends and me in high school. And after graduation, we never saw each other again. Nicholas Kristof, columnist for the New York Times, has spent the last few years writing a series called When Whites Just Don't Get It. He published his 7th installation 2 weeks ago. His premise is that white people are in denial about racial inequities and refuse to believe that they are complicit with systemic racism. Who can argue with that? Yeah. But doesn't there need to be more than this curt dismissal of white people in a racist America? Christoph cited little things like studies that show drivers are less inclined to yield to black pedestrians in a crosswalk than to whites. Teachers favor harsher punishments for students named Deshaun or Darnell than Greg or Jake. America's education system is so structured that white suburban children get an excellent public education, while inner-city black kids get a third-rate education. And then there's the alarming study that black children with appendicitis are less than half as likely to get strong pain medication at an emergency room than white children with appendicitis. Christoph basically ends the column by saying, if you want to know what racism looks like, go and stand in front of a mirror. True enough, no argument. I am complicit in the savagery of institutional racism. I cannot pretend otherwise. But tell me then, how do I grieve when Emmett Till's mutilated body is recovered from the Tallahatchie River? How do I grieve when a black youth is shot 6 times in the back? Don't tell me just go look into a mirror. I have a right to grieve, don't I? James Baldwin wrote a letter to his nephew in 1963 about being black in America. He addressed the constant humiliation which was his life. He also noted, and this is really worthy of just a whole separate topic discussion, he noted that blacks and whites are trapped in a history they do not understand. Right on. Trapped in a history we do not understand. But times have changed. Just a few years ago, Ta-Nehisi Coates wrote a letter to his son. Included in that was this passage. White America is a syndicate arrayed to protect its exclusive power to dominate and control our bodies. Sometimes this power is direct, lynching. Sometimes it is insidious, redlining. But however it appears, the power of domination and exclusion is central to the belief in being white. And without it, white people would cease to exist for want of reasons. I never wrote a letter to my son, but when he was a little over 4, maybe 4.5, we had an experience that I know he still remembers. We were living in Boston, and one day we took the subway, or they call it the T back there. We took the T into town. We were sitting, as we got on the first station at Harvard Square, we're sitting. As the train rolled on, it became more crowded. And at one stop, a group of maybe half a dozen or so African-American high school kids got on. This goes back a number of years. These kids got on with the boom box blaring. They kind of held there to the shoulder. One guy had a basketball. They all were wearing basketball shorts that were riding dangerously low. They kind of hung out there, kidding with each other, some high fives, doing the music. And I felt my son lean into me, absolutely petrified with fear. I couldn't allow this to happen. Not my kid. My instincts took over. I made eye contact with the kid with the basketball. And I went. And he threw me the ball, which really jolted my son. Threw it back to him. And I kind of nodded towards my son. He got it. Came a little closer. Threw the ball to him. My son, I was like, he's a pretty good athlete. Just kind of threw it back. And they were playing catch. And the thing kind of developed because he was obviously a really skilled player, did some Harlem Globetrotter kind of thing. So he could palm the ball and did some fun stuff. And my kid was laughing. And then we got off at our stop. They were undoubtedly continuing. The next 2 stops was Roxbury. My son got off and waved to him, and everything was really kind of cool. And we got to the street. I put my arms around him, and I said, "Were you scared when those big boys came onto the train?" And he said, "Oh, yes, I was." And then what happened? I said, "Well, we played basketball. On the train, play basketball." You become a different person when you're not afraid, I said. But that went over his head, of course. He didn't understand that back then. You know, I wish some white dad would write a letter to his son in this period of time. That letter ought to include stuff like you just can't insist on your innocence because you never hurt anybody, and because slavery and lynching took place a long time ago. I would write, you need to know that these horribly oppressive actions and tactics are still going on today in very real ways, even if you don't want them to. Because by living your life in privilege, you will never appreciate the constancy of black citizens living in fear day and night, every minute. Growing up as a young white man, you may feel the pain of such brutal injustice, but don't think you can ever really empathize. Don't think for a moment you can walk in their shoes. You may think you can, but that would be like trying to own another man's history, and you can't ever do that. So what do you do with all this pain in your heart? I don't know. I mean, you can try to get on a civilian review board. You can post a Black Lives Matter sign. You can vote for the right people who will restore civil rights. You can walk in protest when another unarmed black youth is shot dead. You can start a revolution. You should do all that. But what do you do with your sadness? Well, my son, that's what it means to be white in racist America. You don't quite know where to put the sadness. But I will give you permission about one thing. Should you be listening one day to the album where Terrace Blanchard is playing Breathless, I'm going to tell you, it's going to be okay to cry if you need to.